The winter that year came down hard and early, burying the small town of Kellerton under 3 feet of snow before December had even settled in. The roads turned to packed ice by nightfall, the kind of cold that crept through the walls of old houses and sat in the bones of anyone who spent their days working with their hands. Smoke rose from chimneys along Birch Street, and the few shops that stayed open past 5 o'clock kept their lights burning as if trying to convince the darkness to hold back a little longer. At the far end of Grover Lane, past the feed store and the abandoned hardware shop, there was a garage, a weathered structure with a rusted corrugated roof and wooden walls that had gone gray from decades of exposure. The kind of building that most people drove past without a second glance. Inside, beneath a canvas tarp gone stiff with age, sat a car that had not moved in more than 20 years. When the woman who had built her entire reputation on knowing the value of old automobiles walked into that garage and pulled back the corner of that tarp, she laughed. It was not a gentle laugh. It was the kind of laugh that fills a room and makes everyone else feel smaller for having believed in something she found ridiculous. She turned to the small crowd gathered behind her, and in a voice sharp enough to cut glass, she said, "That car will never run again." Then she pulled out her checkbook and offered $1 million to anyone who could prove her wrong. The crowd laughed with her, all of them, except one. The man standing at the back of the garage, the one with grease still on his knuckles from a job he had finished that morning, said nothing at all. He looked at the car for a long moment, not with the desperate hope of a gambler, not with the wild eyes of someone about to do something foolish, but with the steady, quiet certainty of a man who already knew the answer to a question nobody else had thought to ask. Then he accepted her challenge. Nobody in Kellerton could have imagined what was going to happen next. Marcus Hale had turned 38 in October, and he had spent every one of those years in this town. He was not a large man, but there was a density to him, a quality of weight and solidity that came from decades of physical work. His hands were thick and calloused. His shoulders carried a permanent forward lean from years of bending over engines, and his face had the kind of weathering that happens when a man spends too much time outdoors in a climate that is not particularly forgiving. He lived alone in a 2-bedroom house on the eastern edge of town, a modest place with a sagging porch, a furnace that needed convincing every morning, and a kitchen window that let the cold air seep through no matter how much foam tape he pressed into the frame. The house had been his parents', and before he had time to think seriously about repairs, life had moved on past the point where he could afford them. He made his living as a freelance mechanic, which was a polite way of saying he took whatever work came through the door. Farm equipment, delivery trucks, a neighbor's aging sedan that made a sound nobody could quite describe. In the warmer months, the work was steady enough, but winter was something else. Farmers weren't running equipment. People were putting off repairs until spring. The calls slowed, and Marcus stretched every dollar in ways that required creativity and patience and a willingness to eat the same 4 meals in rotation without complaint. He had been doing it for years, and he had learned to treat financial pressure the way he treated a difficult engine, not with panic, but with methodical attention to what could be controlled and acceptance of what could not. At the back of his property, connected to the house by a concrete path he had poured himself 12 years ago, stood the garage. It was larger than the house in some ways, certainly better insulated, because his father had built it with the specific intention of housing a machine that deserved to be cared for. Inside that garage, under the old canvas tarp, sat a 1969 Dodge Charger. His father, Raymond Hale, had acquired the car the year Marcus was born, which meant the car and the son had arrived in the world at roughly the same time, though the car had stopped moving a great deal sooner. Raymond had driven it exactly 3 times before a stroke took him out of commission. And then, in the way of things, the car had simply stayed where it was. Marcus had grown up in the shadow of it. He had learned the names of its parts before he learned to multiply. He had watched his father run a careful hand along the hood on the rare occasions when Raymond could make it out to the garage, not with the intention of repairing it, but with a tenderness that Marcus had never seen directed at anything else. When Raymond died, the car stayed. When people advised Marcus to sell it, he declined without explaining himself. Occasionally, in the evenings after a long day of work, he would unlock the garage side door, pull the tarp back enough to expose the hood, and wipe the dust from the paint with a clean cloth. He kept the key on a hook just inside his kitchen door. Separate from all his other keys, on a small wooden peg, his father had mounted there for exactly that purpose. He had never talked about why he kept it. He had never told anyone what he suspected, but the knowledge sat in him the way a well-understood tool sits in a skilled hand, present, specific, waiting for the right moment. The annual Kellerton Winter Classic, a vintage car exhibition that drew collectors and enthusiasts from across the region, was scheduled for the third Saturday of January. It was the kind of event that put the town on the map for 3 days every year, brought money into the local economy, and attracted exactly the sort of person who thought they knew everything worth knowing about automobiles built before 1980. Victoria Mercer had made her first major acquisition at the age of 22, a 1957 Ferrari California that she had spotted at an estate sale in Connecticut, while everyone else was looking at the furniture. She was 36 now, and in the intervening 14 years she had built a collection worth somewhere north of $30 million, written 2 books on the valuation of American classic automobiles, and cultivated a public persona that was equal parts expertise and performance. She was not unlikable, exactly. She was sharp and often funny, and she could talk about carburation systems or body panel provenance with the ease of someone discussing the weather. But she had arrived at the level of reputation where she had stopped separating what she knew from what she assumed, and the gap between those two things had quietly grown without her noticing. She came to Kellerton every other year for the Winter Classic. She knew the town, knew the dealers, knew which locals had interesting pieces tucked away in their barns or outbuildings. When word reached her, through the informal network of collectors and local enthusiasts that always surrounded these events, that there was a derelict car sitting in a garage on Grover Lane, a car that hadn't moved since the early 2000s, belonging to a mechanic of no particular reputation, she went to look at it the way she went to look at everything. With confidence, with speed, and with the absolute certainty that her first impression would be correct. She arrived at Marcus's garage on a Thursday afternoon, accompanied by 2 men who served as a combination of assistants and audience. Marcus was there, wiping down a socket set at his workbench. He nodded when they came in. He did not make any particular effort to present the car favorably. He simply pulled back the tarp when she asked him to, and stood to one side while she looked. Victoria circled the Charger with the practiced eye of someone who had seen hundreds of machines in various states of deterioration. She crouched to look at the rocker panels. She peered through the window glass. She pressed on the door with 2 fingers, as if testing the solidity of the steel beneath the paint. Then she straightened up, turned to the men behind her, and began to speak in the way people speak when they are performing their expertise for an audience. "The frame shows significant surface oxidation along the lower rails," she said. "The engine compartment," she continued, lifting the hood without asking Marcus's permission, shows no evidence of recent maintenance. "The carburetor is fouled. The wiring harness shows insulation degradation consistent with 20+ years of neglect. The fuel system is certainly compromised. You can see the staining on the intake." She lowered the hood. She looked at Marcus directly for the first time. "This car will not start," she said. "Whatever this man believes about its condition, I am telling you with complete professional certainty. This machine has not run in decades, and it will not run again without a full engine replacement." The crowd at the garage door, neighbors, a few event attendees who had followed her there out of curiosity, murmured in agreement. Marcus said nothing. He leaned against his workbench with his arms crossed and watched her with an expression that revealed nothing at all. Victoria looked at him a moment longer, and something about his stillness must have registered, because she added, "I'll put a number on that certainty. $1 million says that car does not start under its own original power within 30 days. And just to be clear," she added, "replacing the engine doesn't count. Whatever runs that car, if anything runs it, has to be what's already in it." She said it lightly, as if the bet were a kind of joke, a theatrical punctuation mark on her assessment. She did not believe, in that moment, that anyone would accept it. The crowd pressed in a little. Someone near the back called out something encouraging, half teasing, half daring. Marcus looked at the car. He looked at Victoria. He looked back at the car. There was a silence of perhaps 15 seconds, which is a long time when a room full of people is watching a single person decide something. Then he said, "I'll take that." The reaction in the garage was immediate and varied. Two people laughed outright. One man shook his head slowly, the way you shake your head at someone who has just made a very public mistake. A woman near the door took out her phone. Victoria Mercer blinked once, a small, involuntary response, and then composed herself into a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. She extended her hand, and Marcus shook it without hesitation. The terms were simple. 30 days, original engine, running under its own power, with a neutral third party to verify the result. Hands were shaken. The paperwork, such as it was, would be formalized through the event organizers at the Winter Classic. By that evening, the local news station had a brief segment. By the next morning, a regional automotive publication had run a short piece. By the end of the week, the story had escaped Kellerton entirely and was circulating in collector forums and automotive enthusiast communities across several states. Victoria gave a brief interview in which she described the bet as a generous impulse on her part, a way of giving someone with more optimism than knowledge a chance to learn something about the reality of mechanical restoration. She said it kindly, as if she were doing Marcus a favor, as if the education he was about to receive at the hands of reality was something she had generously arranged for his benefit. Marcus, for his part, gave no interviews. A reporter called the house twice. Both times he let it ring. He closed the garage door, turned on the work lights, and began. The first thing he did was nothing. He stood beside the charger for 20 minutes with a legal pad and a pen, looking at it the way his father had taught him to look at anything mechanical, not hunting for problems, but listening, in the metaphorical sense, for what the machine itself was telling him. Then he started at the beginning. He pulled the tarp off completely for the first time in years and folded it neatly in the corner. He opened the hood and set it on its support rod. He crouched beside each wheel well in turn. He went through the interior, lifting floor mats, checking beneath the seats, running his hand along the dashboard. He did all of this in silence, making notes in a handwriting that only he could fully decipher: shorthand codes, numbers, small sketches of component arrangements. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 9 degrees. The garage held some heat from a propane heater he kept running in the corner, but the air was still cold enough that he could see his breath when he leaned into the engine compartment. He worked until 2 in the morning on the first night. Then he went inside, slept for 5 hours, and came back. The fuel system was compromised in the way he expected. The tank had residue that had hardened over the years. The fuel lines were stiff and cracked at the bends, and the carburetor was fouled with varnish deposits that had formed as old gasoline evaporated and left its chemistry behind. The wiring harness was brittle, with several sections where the insulation had cracked and the bare copper beneath had oxidized. The battery was dead and unsalvageable, which was expected. The ignition system needed full attention points: condenser, rotor, distributor cap. The cooling system had a hardened mess in the radiator that would need to be flushed with the kind of chemical patience that the job required. The cold was its own kind of adversary. At night, with the propane heater cycling on and off and the temperature outside dropping past 0, the metal components he was working with would contract slightly enough to matter when tolerances were as specific as these. He had learned to account for this during his years of winter work, adjusting for what the cold did to aluminum versus what it did to steel, keeping critical components on a shelf near the heater when they needed to stay at a consistent temperature. Some nights the heater ran out of propane at 2 in the morning, and he would drive to the 24-hour gas station on the edge of town to exchange the canister and the woman at the register, a heavy-set lady named Carla, who had been working that shift for as long as anyone could remember, would look at him with the careful expression of someone who wanted to ask a question but had decided it was not her business. He appreciated that about Carla. He had no budget for new parts. This was not a choice, it was a fact of his financial situation, and he approached it the way he approached everything about money, which was to acknowledge the constraint and find another path. He had a collection of parts in various states of usefulness, accumulated over decades of mechanical work, a kind of private inventory that filled 4 shelving units along the back wall of the garage, and 3 stacked bins near the workbench. He knew every piece in that collection, the way a librarian knows the books on the shelves. He began pulling what he needed, cross-referencing dimensions, testing resistance, setting aside what was usable and returning what was not. There were memories woven into the work. His father, Raymond, had started teaching him mechanics at an age when most children were still learning to ride bicycles. Not because Raymond thought it was important for his son to be a mechanic, he had wanted Marcus to go to college, to study engineering properly, to work somewhere with a salary and benefits. But Raymond had believed that the hands needed to understand the work before the mind could trust itself to design it. You have to feel what it does before you can think about why it does it, he used to say. In his slow, deliberate way, Marcus had taken that lesson in directions Raymond had not quite anticipated. He had not gone to college. He had stayed in Kellerton, stayed near the garage, stayed close to the machines that made sense to him in a way that other things in life sometimes did not. He did not regret it most of the time. But on cold nights, alone in the garage, with the town sleeping and the snow piling up outside, the weight of that choice was a real and present thing. He worked until he could not see straight, slept when his body insisted, and began again. The days blurred together, in the way days do when a person is in the grip of a single consuming task. On the 8th day, he noticed something unusual. He was replacing a section of the wiring harness near the firewall when his flashlight caught something on the engine block that stopped him. It was a number, a serial stamp, partially obscured by decades of grime and a thin layer of surface oxidation. He cleaned it carefully with a rag and a small wire brush, working slowly and with more attention than the task seemed to require. Because something in the back of his mind was already turning. The number that emerged did not match anything in the production records he had in his head, and Marcus Hale had spent a significant portion of his life memorizing production records. He had developed the habit in his 20s, when he had started doing restoration work on the side, and had learned, expensively, that the difference between a genuine original and a well-executed clone came down exactly to numbers and codes that most people never bothered to look for. He had since made it a point to look for them always. He photographed the stamp with his phone, then cleaned the area more thoroughly, then photographed it again. He sat back on his heels and looked at it for a long time. Then he went inside, opened his laptop on the kitchen table, and spent 3 hours cross-referencing the number against every database and technical archive he could access: online forums, digitized factory documents, a scanned copy of a 1969 Chrysler Corporation internal specification manual that he had paid $40 for from a collector's estate 5 years ago, because something had told him it might be useful someday. What he found did not give him a definitive answer, but it gave him a direction. The stamp format was not consistent with standard production units from the Hamtramck assembly plant. It matched, partially and imperfectly, a code structure referenced in one obscure footnote in the specification manual, a reference to a small number of pre-production evaluation units assembled for internal engineering assessment before the full model year run began. These units had been built by hand, or nearly so, with specifications that deviated from the production standard in ways that engineering departments sometimes did when they were testing the limits of what a platform could do. Most of them were destroyed after evaluation, as was common practice. A small number had been sold to employees or otherwise dispersed. Their ultimate whereabouts were largely unknown. Marcus did not allow himself to feel the weight of what this might mean. He wrote down what he had found, put the notebook beside his bed, and went back to work in the morning. He had a carburetor to rebuild, and he was not going to let a mystery distract him from the job. 12 days into the work, the engine did not start. He had expected this. The first attempt at ignition was always diagnostic, a way of hearing what the machine still refused to do and working backward from that refusal to its cause. He cranked it, listened to the starter motor turn over without catching, watched the tachometer sit at 0, and noted what he heard and felt. He did it 3 more times, making adjustments between each attempt. On the 4th try, there was a suggestion, a brief, half-hearted cough from the engine that was not ignition, but was something better than nothing. He made more notes. Outside, a reporter from the regional paper drove by and took a photograph of the closed garage door. The accompanying caption on the news site read something along the lines of, "Kellerton Mechanics' million-dollar gamble shows no sign of progress." Victoria Mercer, reached for comment, said she hoped the story would be instructive for people who confused optimism with expertise. She said it without malice, in the smooth professional register of someone managing a narrative. The piece ran with her photograph at the top and a stock image of a rusting car at the bottom. Marcus did not read it. He found out about it from his neighbor, an older man named Harold, who appeared at the garage door on a Saturday morning with coffee and a look of careful concern. Harold did not say that he thought Marcus should give up. He did not say that, but the coffee was a gesture of sympathy, and Marcus understood its grammar. He thanked Harold, drank the coffee standing at the workbench, and went back to work. He had identified the primary issue with the fuel delivery system by then, a combination of a blocked main jet in the carburetor and a partial collapse in one section of the fuel line that was preventing consistent pressure from reaching the engine. He had rebuilt the carburetor himself, using the old unit as a reference and fabricating one replacement component from a piece of aluminum bar stock he had in the back of the parts shelves. The fuel line section he replaced with a period-correct piece he had sourced by calling in a favor from a supplier 3 towns over who sometimes had old stock in the back of his warehouse. The ignition timing needed recalibration. The distributor had been set at a specification that might have been correct at some point, but was no longer appropriate for the engine's current state. He adjusted it in small increments, testing and listening between each change, in the way that his father had taught him to work with machines that had long memories and short patience. He was not sleeping well. He was eating irregularly. There were moments, usually around 3 in the morning, when the propane heater had cycled off, and the cold was settling back into the garage, and his hands were stiff, and the engine was still not running, when something in him very much wanted to stop. Not because he thought he was wrong. He was fairly certain he was not wrong. But certainty is a different thing from energy, and energy was what he was running low on. He stood once at the garage side door looking out at the street at the snow, and the dark and the lights of Harold's house across the way, and thought about what it would mean to call Victoria Mercer in the morning and concede the bet, not because he could not afford to lose, though he could not afford to lose, but because the car deserved to run again, and because his father had believed in it, and because he did not know how to look at something broken and walk away from it while there was still work he had not yet tried. That was the thing about being a mechanic that was not about engines at all. It was about a refusal to accept incompletion as a permanent state, a belief that function was the natural condition of a thing well made, and that dysfunction was merely a problem not yet fully understood. He closed the door. He went back to the workbench. What carried him through those moments was not dramatic. It was a particular memory, his father's hands on a carburetor, moving with the deliberate patience of someone who understood that a machine was not an obstacle but a conversation. "Take your time with it," Raymond would say. "It already knows what it needs. You're just asking it to tell you." Marcus took his time. He had no other option that made any sense. With 5 days remaining before the deadline, he stayed in the garage for 31 consecutive hours. He ate crackers and canned soup, heated on a camp stove he set up near the side door. He slept for 90 minutes on a cot he dragged in from the storage room. Woke up with a clarity that only comes from that particular depth of exhaustion, and went back to the engine. The final adjustments were the smallest, and in some ways the most important, calibrating the fuel-air mixture, resetting the timing to the precise degree that the engine's compression characteristics demanded, bleeding the cooling system until he was confident the circulation was complete. The snow outside had piled up to the base of the garage windows. The temperature was holding at 4 degrees. He could not feel his feet particularly well, but his hands were warm enough from working. On the 4th night before the deadline, he sat in the driver's seat for the first time. He adjusted the seat. It needed no adjustment. because his proportions were almost exactly his father's proportions, a fact he had noticed and never mentioned to anyone. He placed his right hand on the key. He did not turn it. He sat with his eyes closed for a moment, which was not a superstition and not a prayer, but something closer to acknowledgement, a recognition that the work was done, and that whatever happened next was a conversation between him and the machine, and that he had done his part honestly. Then he opened his eyes and turned the key to the first position and listened to the fuel pump pressurize the system. He turned the key to the second position. The starter motor engaged. The engine turned over. Once, twice. On the third rotation, it caught not fully, not cleanly, but it caught. And for 1 second, the cylinders fired in sequence. And the sound that came from under the hood was the sound of controlled combustion, which is to say, it was the sound of something working the way it was built to work. Then it died. He sat for a moment. Then he made 2 small additional adjustments to the mixture screw on the carburetor, went back to the driver's seat, and tried again. This time it caught on the second rotation, held for 3 seconds, and died. He was close. He could feel the proximity of it the way you can feel the edge of a piece of furniture in the dark, not yet touching it, but aware of exactly where it is. He did not sleep that night. He worked through until the morning light came gray and thin through the garage windows, and when it did, he had an answer. The day of the judgment arrived cold and bright, with the kind of winter clarity that makes everything look sharp-edged and real. Word had spread in the way that small-town news spreads completely and without restraint, and by the time 10 o'clock came around, there were well over 200 people standing in and around the garage and the stretch of Grover Lane outside it. Cars were parked all the way to the intersection with Miller Road. A group of older men who had been coming to the Winter Classic for years stood near the garage door with their arms crossed and their faces set in the careful, neutral expression of people who have opinions but are too experienced to express them before an outcome is known. Children had climbed up on the fence that ran along the side of the property. Someone had brought a thermos of coffee that was being passed around. The Kellerton Fire Department had sent 2 volunteers to manage the crowd, which was both more and less than anyone had expected. 2 local television cameras were set up near the garage door. A neutral evaluator, a mechanical engineer, and certified appraiser named Daniel Fossey, who had driven up from the city at the Winter Classic Committee's request, stood to one side with a clipboard and a camera of his own. The atmosphere had the quality of something that could go either way, not hostile, but charged, in the way that any public moment of reckoning carries a charge. Victoria Mercer arrived at 9:55, which was 5 minutes early, which Marcus noticed but did not remark on. She was dressed well and composed, and she shook Daniel Fossey's hand with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to professional formality. She did not speak to Marcus directly. She looked at the Charger, which was sitting with its hood down and its tarp completely removed for the first time in front of witnesses, and her expression was professionally neutral, which was different, Marcus thought, from actually neutral. There was something careful about it. He could not have said exactly what he read in it, but he had spent a lot of years reading the signals that machines gave off, and he had come to believe that people were not entirely different from machines in that regard. They told you things whether they meant to or not, if you knew how to listen. He walked to the car. The crowd went quiet in the way crowds go quiet when something is genuinely about to happen. He opened the driver's door. The hinges moved smoothly. He had lubricated them 2 nights ago. He sat down. He pulled the door closed. 200 people watched him reach for the ignition. Victoria Mercer stood with her arms at her sides, and her jaw set in a line that was not quite relaxed. The cameras were rolling. Marcus put the key in the ignition. He turned it to the first position, and the fuel pump hummed. And every person in the garage could hear it because the silence was so complete. He turned it to the second position. The starter engaged. The engine turned over once. There was a collective intake of breath. The engine turned over a second time. Someone near the back of the crowd made a sound that was not quite a word. On the third rotation, the engine caught and held and built. And the sound that filled the garage was not a sputter or a cough, but a deep, authoritative, fully realized combustion, roar the sound of 335 horsepower, waking up after more than 2 decades of silence. The vibration moved through the concrete floor and up through the legs of everyone standing in the garage. The cameras swung toward the engine. Daniel Fossey stepped forward and looked at the exhaust, at the gauges visible through the windshield, at the oil pressure indicator climbing to where it belonged. He made a note on his clipboard. Marcus sat in the driver's seat with both hands on the steering wheel and let the engine run. He did not look at Victoria. He did not look at the crowd. He looked through the windshield at the garage wall, at the shelving units full of parts, at the wooden workbench where his father had first shown him the inside of a carburetor, and he let the engine run. It was Daniel Fossey who first noticed the detail that changed everything. He was photographing the engine compartment, a standard part of his verification process, when he paused and looked more carefully at the engine block. He looked for a long time. Then he put down his clipboard and went to his bag and retrieved a different piece of equipment, a magnifying loupe and a small ultraviolet light. He crouched beside the engine and looked at something near the firewall for almost 2 minutes without speaking. The crowd was watching him now, not the engine. When he stood up, his expression was difficult to read. He walked to Marcus, who had shut the engine off and stepped out of the car, and he said something quietly. Marcus nodded once, in the way that a person nods when they are hearing something confirmed rather than something new. The number on the engine block was what Daniel Fossey had seen. He verified it against 3 reference sources on his tablet computer, while the crowd waited in an unusual patience, because something in the quality of the expert's attention had communicated that this was not a routine moment. What he confirmed carefully, precisely, with the methodology of a professional who understood that his reputation was attached to what he was about to say, was that the Charger sitting in Marcus Hale's garage was not a production unit. It was a pre-production engineering evaluation prototype, one of an estimated 4, built by Chrysler Corporation's Advanced Powertrain Group in the winter of 1968 for internal performance assessment prior to the official 1969 model year release. The engine differed from the production 440 in several measurable ways: compression ratio, internal tolerancing, hand-fitted components that would have been immediately apparent to anyone who had looked carefully. The bodywork carried subtle but identifiable modifications to the hood and rocker panels that were consistent with prototype aerodynamic testing documentation from the period. The VIN structure, properly decoded and cross-referenced against Chrysler's internal prototype registration system, placed this specific vehicle at the Highland Park Engineering Facility in November of 1968. Of the 4 units believed to have been built, 2 had been documented as destroyed during testing. 1 had been unaccounted for in the historical record for more than 50 years. And this one, it appeared, had been acquired through channels that were neither well documented nor particularly traceable by Raymond Hale, who had worked as a parts supplier's representative with regional Chrysler dealerships in the late 1960s, and who had apparently understood what he had, and had told no one, and had left it to his son. The crowd in the garage went through something that was not quite silence and not quite noise, a kind of collective recalibration, a rearrangement of understanding. The television cameras, which had been prepared to record either a triumphant startup or a humiliating failure, were now recording something neither of their operators had anticipated. Victoria Mercer stood very still. She looked at the car with an expression that had shed its professional composure entirely and replaced it with something that was simply human, the expression of someone who has looked at a thing many times and understood it incorrectly, and who is in the process of recognizing that fact. Daniel Fossey had begun the process of estimating value. He was careful with the language because he was a professional, and these things required careful language, but what he communicated to the gathering was that a confirmed, running, original specification Chrysler pre-production prototype from this period, in this condition, with provenance that could be established through factory records, represented a category of collectible automotive history, for which no standard market value existed because there was no standard market. Comparable pieces, when they surfaced, did not sell for tens of thousands. They sold for millions. The figure he offered as a preliminary, conservative, unverified estimate was not a number anyone in that garage had been thinking about when the morning started. The regional automotive publication that had run the skeptical piece about Marcus's chances was, by that afternoon, running an entirely different story. Victoria Mercer found Marcus 2 hours after the crowd had dispersed. He was back at his workbench, drinking coffee from a thermos, and looking at nothing in particular, the particular kind of stillness that comes after a long and concentrated effort, when the body has burned through its reserves and the mind is simply resting in the fact of completion. She knocked on the open garage door, which was a courtesy he noticed. He gestured for her to come in. She had her coat on, and her hands in her pockets. And she looked, for the first time since he had met her, like a person rather than a performance. She placed an envelope on the workbench. $1 million, she said. The certified check is in there. It's already signed. He looked at the envelope. He didn't pick it up immediately. She sat on the stool near the parts shelving without asking, but also without the entitlement that had characterized her first visit, and she said, "I need to ask you something." "Go ahead," he said. "Why didn't you just tell me what it was?" He considered this for a moment. He topped off his coffee from the thermos and set it back on the bench. "Because it wasn't my job to teach you," he said, "and I wasn't certain. And because the car needed to run before any of the rest of it mattered." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the Charger, which was sitting without its tarp now, the way it was going to sit from now on. "Why didn't you ever sell it?" she asked. "Because my father didn't sell it," he said. And he was smarter than most people gave him credit for. She absorbed this. Then she looked at the workbench, at the tools laid out in the particular order that Marcus kept them. Each one returned to its place when the work was done, and something in her expression shifted in the way expressions shift when a person is revising a picture they had carried for a long time. She had built her career on speed and confidence and the instinctive efficiency of rapid assessment. Those qualities had served her well for 14 years. They had, in this case, led her precisely to the wrong conclusion. She understood why. She had stopped looking beyond the first thing she saw, because the first thing she saw had stopped surprising her. She was 36 years old. And that was an uncomfortable thing to recognize about yourself. She absorbed this too. Then she said, "How did you know it would run?" He shook his head slightly. Not a dismissal, but a correction. "I didn't know it would run," he said. "I knew I could make it run." "Those are different things." She looked at him. "I made a lot of assumptions about what I was looking at," she said. "I know," he said, without particular emphasis. "I do it in the other direction. I look too long at what something could be. Maybe. And I miss what other people see right away. I'm not sure which one is worse." She almost smiled at this. She stood up, buttoned her coat, and looked at the Charger one more time with the unhurried attention she had not given it on her first visit. "It's remarkable," she said. "The exhaust note when it started, I've never heard a 440 do that." "That's not a stock 440, he said. "That's what Daniel's report will say." "I know," she said. "I should have known it from the sound." She paused at the garage door. "For what it's worth," she said, "I've been doing this for 14 years, and I have never been this wrong before." He picked up the envelope from the bench. He examined it, then put it down again. "For what it's worth," he said. "I've been working on that car in some form or another since I was about 9 years old." She nodded. She stepped out into the cold. He heard her car start and pull away, down Grover Lane, and then the only sound was the wind pressing against the garage walls and the occasional tick of cooling metal from the Charger's engine. By the end of that week, the story had gone wider than either of them intended. The automotive collector community has a particular relationship with scarcity, a confirmed prototype, running under original power, with provenance traceable to a factory serial record, represented a category of discovery that occurred perhaps once in a generation. The people who understood what that meant had resources and intentions to match their understanding, and they moved quickly when something of this nature surfaced. The automotive collector community has a particular relationship with discovery. It is simultaneously small enough that significant news travels fast, and large enough that significant news when it travels, reaches people with serious resources. 3 of the most respected vintage vehicle auction houses in the country made contact. A museum in Detroit sent a curator who drove up without an appointment and stood in the garage for 2 hours, taking photographs and asking questions in a voice that had the quality of someone trying not to appear as overwhelmed as felt. A documentary production company sent an email that Marcus did not respond to for 2 weeks, and then did respond to, briefly, because Harold from next door pointed out that it might be worth his while. The formal appraisal, conducted 6 weeks after the engine start verification by a team of 3 independent evaluators, placed the vehicle's value pending full provenance documentation, which was ongoing at a figure that made the $1 million bet look like a rounding error. Marcus did not make any immediate decisions about the car. He was not a person who made immediate decisions, which was one of the things that had made the garage work possible in the first place. He continued his freelance mechanic business. He fixed a compressor for the feed store and replaced the brake system on Harold's truck and drove out to a farm on the county line to look at a tractor that had been sitting since harvest. The Charger sat in the garage, without its tarp, and he looked at it every day. In the spring, when the snow had fully retreated and the roads had dried out, he spent 3 weekends completing the remaining cosmetic and mechanical restoration, not to change what the car was, but to return it to the condition it had been designed to achieve, using techniques and materials consistent with the period. He polished the paint by hand, working panel by panel in small circular motions, with a compound that a retired bodyman in the next county had recommended years ago, and that Marcus had kept a supply of ever since. The paint that emerged from beneath the oxidation was not a bright showroom color. It was deeper than that, the color of something that had aged into its own character. He reconditioned the interior. He replaced the rubber seals and weather stripping with period-correct materials sourced from a specialist he had located through the collector network, a man in Ohio who had spent 40 years accumulating new old stock components that most restoration shops had stopped looking for. He had contacted through the collector network that had, in the intervening months, begun to treat his name with a certain amount of careful respect, which was a new experience, and one he was still finding the right relationship with. On the first warm Saturday of April, he opened both garage doors fully for the first time in as long as he could remember. He started the engine. It caught on the second try, as it had been doing consistently since he found the correct carburetor calibration, and he let it warm up for 3 minutes. He listened to it idle. The sound it made at idle was not entirely like a production 440. It had a slightly different quality, at low RPM, a texture to the note that he had come to recognize as characteristic of the hand-fitted tolerances inside the block. Engineers built things to a specification, and then sometimes, when they were building something for themselves to evaluate, rather than for a customer to purchase, they built them a little better than the specification required. That was what this engine was. It was something built with care beyond requirement, by people who understood what they were doing well enough to exceed what they had been asked to do. He let himself appreciate that for a moment before he put it in gear. He put it in gear. He drove it out of the garage and onto the concrete path, and then onto Grover Lane, for the first time since his father had parked it there. The sound was something that the neighborhood had never heard before, or, more precisely, had not heard in more than 2 decades, and several people came out onto their porches to see what it was. Harold stood at his mailbox with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched the Charger roll past with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite something else but somewhere between them. He raised one hand as Marcus passed, a small gesture of something that did not require a name. Marcus raised 2 fingers off the steering wheel in acknowledgement, the same gesture his father had used when driving past someone he knew, a small economy of greeting that had passed between them without comment, and now passed between Marcus and Harold the same way. He drove it through the town past the feed store and the place where the hardware shop used to be, past the school and the gas station and the church with the broken weather vane that nobody had gotten around to fixing, and then he drove back. He brought it into the garage and parked it. He shut the engine off. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment in the silence that followed, in the particular quality of quiet that a garage has after an engine has been running in it, and he thought about his father, who had known what he had, and had kept it quietly, and had trusted that the right person would understand it at the right time. The winter light, which had been so hard and unforgiving for so many months, had given way to the softer angle of April's sun, and it came through the garage windows and fell across the hood of the Charger in a way that showed the depth of the paint, the quality of the steel, the care that had been put into something designed to be more than ordinary. Outside, the last of the snow had retreated to the shadowed places under the hedges and along the north walls where the sun still could not reach. The town of Kellerton went on in its ordinary way. The feed store opened. The school buses ran. Harold walked to his mailbox and back. And in the garage on Grover Lane, a man who had spent his life learning to listen to machines sat with his hands on a steering wheel and understood, in the full and quiet way that understanding sometimes arrives, that the most valuable things are not always the ones that announce themselves, and that the difference between something broken and something waiting is often nothing more than the patience and the knowledge to tell them apart.